Welcome to another episode of The Deep Dive, where we are looking to pick up our conversation from the weekend. We just had an episode where Dr. Paul Utnage joined me to talk kind of about the theology of the parable we focused on. Talked about hell, talked about judgment a little bit, and wanted to maybe have a lighter conversation, but maybe more of a applicable or relevant one for a lot of people, and that's just tackling this question of what does it look like for us to grow? What does it look like for us to grow in different spaces? This is an audio-only episode, so if you are watching on YouTube and you are wondering why you can't see us, that is the reason. But I am joined today by two friends, two coworkers, Bret Toth and Kyle Bradley. Both of these guys have been great conversational partners for me, just as we've kind of thought about this idea, this topic over the last couple of weeks, preparing for the message. But guys, as we get started, one, thank you for joining. I know, Bret, you have spent a lot of energy avoiding existing in digital spheres and the internet. But what is it, I guess, if you just would let introduce yourself. This is the first time on the podcast. So introduce yourself. Who are you? And then what is it about this topic that maybe resonates with you, just as we get started?
Okay. I'm Bret Toth. I'm the co-director upstairs at Restoration. Mm-hmm. And I think I've just, whatever words you used in your sermon of maturity, growth, transformation, I think upstairs we try to, make that our daily, weekly rhythms in our own personal lives, in our staff, and in our clients. Mm. And so hearing the sermon, reading that parable, really diving into it, something opened up inside of me, and I was just like, oh, wow. And I just started thinking of things and writing some things down, and it took me to some places. So.
Awesome. And your background, you're a professional counselor.
Yes.
Therapist by trade, educated at Covenant here in St. Louis.
And Southwest Baptist before that.
SBU, go Bearcats.
Probably about 10 years before you were there.
Yeah. And then Kyle, you're our communications director, media director.
Yep.
What about this topic or this idea of growth, change, sticks out to you?
Well, since we're not on video, I'll just say it. I think Bret talking about like recognizing some things or maybe being challenged, like just when you were saying that, you had a huge smile on your face, and like that is exciting. Like for somebody just to be excited about talking about their own growth is exciting. But my own journey, I mean, just is kind of going maybe deeper or heavier than we want to. I think growth is sort of forced upon me just because of some of the things I've had to grieve over the years. And it was sort of like grow or I think felt like cease to be on some level. So I care a lot about my own personal growth to just live well. Byproduct of that is I care a lot about other people's growth. I think some of the ways I do that is through the arts, so through poetry and things like that, trying to connect with people and have conversations and help myself and others maybe see some things about themselves that they could step into. If that makes sense.
Yeah. No. Yeah. So I'm really excited about this conversation. Before we just kind of dive in and hear what God is, how God's been leading you, or things that you've learned from others. Just want to preface it. Just we're in Matthew chapter 13, verse 24 through 36-ish, and then Jesus he explains it in the following verses. But in this parable, it's classically known as the parable of the tares, or the parable of the weeds. And you have this story where you have a master who his workers, they plant good seed, and then in the middle of the night an enemy comes and he plants weeds among the wheat. And as the wheat is growing, the servants realize, hey, there's weeds that are growing amongst the wheat. And their first impulse is, hey, master, did you plant bad seed? Which is just a fascinating, like, that their first thought is, hey, did you do something wrong here?
You screwed this up.
You screwed this up. You sure you got the right thing? Mm-hmm. And he said, no, an enemy did this. So they're like, hey, should we go ahead and pluck all the weeds? Like, let's rid ourselves of all the bad stuff so the good stuff can grow. And he goes, no, don't do that. Actually, if you do that, you might uproot the wheat. So let both of them grow together. And at the proper time, when it's time for the harvest, we'll first gather all the weeds, We'll bundle them up. We'll throw them in the fire, and then we'll gather the wheat and have you take that to my barn, to my storehouse. So that's the story that Jesus tells. Mm-hmm. And then several verses later, his disciples come and they say, hey, tell us what you meant by that. And he goes and he interprets it, and he says, okay, well, the master is God, and the servants are so-and-so, the wheat is this, the weeds are the, like he interprets it, gives it all the meaning, and then talks about judgment that's coming. And so we really talked through some of the explanation in the previous episode of the deep dive. But this idea of wheat and weeds growing together has really stuck with me, because I think like in the church we just want to get rid of all the bad stuff, and it makes us really uncomfortable. And we want to be among the wheat. We want other people just to see our wheaty areas, and we just kind of want to maybe ignore the weedy stuff. And so anyway, that's kind of the premise, and I really don't have an agenda for this conversation other than to hear from you. I know, Brett, you and I, we've been talking back and forth, left me some voice messages, you had some texts. You sent me...
I get manic when I get excited, and I got excited about this passage.
You sent me some texts that you sent to yourself, even in this as well.
And I text myself.
So anyway, let's just start there. Like, what are some of the maybe higher level ideas or themes that y'all see running through this parable?
Okay. First, a quick, I guess it would be a theological question.
Go for it.
Is Jesus always that exacting in an explanation? I was reading that passage and I'm like, he's like, this means this, this means this, this means this.
Yeah,
this
it's kind of surgical.
Yeah. And I was like, that seems,
almost never.
Okay. That's what I was like, when's the last time I felt this energy out of Jesus? And
yeah, never. It catches you off guard.
It did. Now, so what's that about?
In Matthew, it's interesting because he's very willing to talk. So culturally, something's happening. Like, we don't like to talk about hell. We don't like to talk about judgment. And yet Jesus actually speaks about it quite regularly, especially in the book of Matthew. I don't know what it is about the exactness. I do know that, like, when it comes to parables, we can get overly distracted by the details of the parables when he's usually just responding to like a single question or a single expectation.
Yeah, because I feel like most of his is to kind of invite you into something more like poetically elusive that can't be defined. And he just went to town on the answer.
So I don't know. I do know that the people who were originally listening had particular expectations of how how God was going to inaugurate and bring about his kingdom. They had a narrow read on what the kingdom is and what it meant for their lives. And I think that's why Jesus is telling all these stories. Hey, the kingdom of heaven is like a pearl, right? That, someone found, or, went and this treasure that he found, he buried in a field, went and sold everything he had and went to go find it. Like, he tells all these different stories to get us closer to the kingdom. And yet this is just one of them. So the original hearers would have been, hey, we have expectations of what it means for a Messiah to come. We have expectations of what we're being delivered from, which hell is one of those things. But they had this idea of a political ruler coming and just delivering them from the Romans, the Roman occupation, for raising Israel back to a prominent place in the world. And I think what Jesus is doing here, I think, is he's saying, hey, the kingdom is actually bigger than that.
Okay.
It's an expansive thing that expands eternity. And then there's this question of like, am I among the wheat or am I among the weeds? And so,
scary question.
It's an incredibly scary question, but it's not an inappropriate question, right? And so, and I do think this is where I come back to, like, I think I used an illustration this weekend of like, we can be our own worst enemy, and yet, like, I have been an enemy of God. I'm actively an enemy of God. I'm an enemy of the change and the growth God wants to do in me, in my heart. But Romans 5 talks about me being an enemy of God, and yet in that moment, God still extends a relationship and has died for me. And what he is inviting me into is more than a political empire. It's more than, hey, I want a spot on the world stage because it's nice to be blessed by God. It's, he's invited us into a life of change and growth. And yes, we want to avoid judgment. Yes, we want to avoid being among the weeds. But the Jewish people were constantly like, okay, well, we're good and they're bad. And yet, as we see in the parable, as we see the story of the wheat that's growing, a lot of times, at least early on, you can't really distinguish very well between the two because they're together. And Jesus is okay with that. Like the master in the story is completely patient, and he's completely okay with this idea of, for growth to happen, it's going to be accompanied by stuff that's growth in other ways, but it's growth that you don't want.
Yeah, that's what I wonder about when I think about this, is how often do we, maybe the scripture is talking about people, or we want to think it is, but how often do we just confuse the weeds and the wheat? We confuse a great opportunity for growth as something that's bad, something that we've done that's wrong, or something that somebody else has done, when it's really this wonderful invitation into growth.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where my mind went, is just how it's confusing in a sense of trying to, I think even in my own life, distinguish between the two. Yeah. I want it to be obvious.
Yeah. So I guess that's where I'm, when I think about the patience that the master has when he says, hey, servants, you don't have to go and pluck up the weeds. Like, don't be too quick to do that, because you might actually hurt the growth. That's kind of an uncomfortable thing. Like, so again, the focus of the parable, Jesus is speaking, and there are two groups of people, and these two people he defines as different. But I don't think it's inappropriate for us as we read this to even notice, hey, there's good growth in me and potential in me, and things that God is created me to be a whole person. So like explore that person and learn that person. But there's also some weedy stuff in me too. Also, I hate the fact that the words wheat and weeds are so similar in English.
Yeah.
So I'm saying, when I'm using this as an adjective, weedy, it's the weeds, like, you guys hear that. But anyway.
Yeah. And I think it invites you into an exposure of, like, I don't know, like arrogance, of your own arrogance, of like, who are you, to say who's wheat and who's weeds, or who are you to say that weeds are bad and aren't going to be used by God later on? One of the things I thought of thinking about this was, Christian dude quoting Tolkien, but I thought of that scene where Frodo's talking to Gandalf and they see Gollum, the weed, and Frodo's like, pity Bilbo didn't kill him when he had the chance. And
that's so good.
And Gandalf is like, maybe pity stopped Bilbo's hand from killing him. Like, I still think Gollum has a part to play in all this. And then, so the weed that Frodo wanted to pull ends up being the very thing that causes the destruction of the greatest evil at the end of the movie. And I don't know. There's just who are you to say, right? Like, how all of this is going to play out.
Yeah, and there's something to be said about, I was thinking about this when we were in Ecclesiastes several months ago, but the rain falls on the wicked and the righteous, right? Like, God's grace and favor, if we're doing the whole blessing thing right, like, there's going to be a lot of weeds that are blessed. You think about the field, like, the weeds get exactly what the wheat gets. It gets time to grow, it gets fertilizer, it gets sunlight, it gets water. So there is something about, like, I think Dan threw out in a teaching team that a better title for this parable might be The Field of Common Grace, because it's like the wheats, their growth is not accentuated by the weeds, but if the weeds were removed, the growth of the wheat doesn't happen. And so there are things that I think God is going to do in our lives that might be someone else's kind of weedy stuff, and yet it does lead to our growth in other ways too, if we pursue it.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful example, the Tolkien one, because it's like, in the last possible moment, we still have potential for wheat, right? Like, we still have both of those things in us. And I think another place my mind went in all this was pain and discomfort, and like, we don't want to experience those things. Like, if we stop looking at the golems or looking at whoever else, trying to find the weeds among the people around us. There's plenty to look at in ourselves, right? Like there's plenty of weeds in my own life. And can I set aside my ego long enough and with enough humility, maybe receive my own, like through self-reflection, where my weeds are at, or through maybe somebody else's comment? Like, can I take what my wife says and not just get defensive, but be like, oh no, she's right. I did something disrespectful or whatever else. Yeah. And then that is an opportunity. It's a wonderful opportunity to repair a relationship, to change, to maybe do something different next time.
That's an invitation.
Yeah.
Into
and I think most of those things are. I think most discomfort, most pain. I told you guys earlier, one of my favorite quotes is Mr. Rogers. There's no normal life that is free of pain. And I always miss the second part, but it's the very wrestling with our problems that can be the impetus for our growth. Like, that guy's amazing just anyway, but like he nailed it there, I think. Like, you can run from pain, or you can enter into the invitation that offers and let it, I think, reshape you.
Yeah.
Go for it.
No, that smile you saw on my face, I start getting like excited. Then I'm like, okay, I need to say this, but I have to start like 3 stories back. And so, what did you just say? So Brad, earlier you mentioned, so you're reading that and you're like, oh, am I wheat or am I the weed? Therapists are annoying for a lot of reasons. One of them is that we answer most multiple choice questions with yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're all of it. Trying to figure out where to start that. There's a brand of therapy called internal family systems. And
it's really popular.
Yeah, very right now. It's kind of the sexy thing. And the beginner's guide goes something like, you're a full self. There's a wholeness to you, and then trauma happens to you. Something happens. You don't get needs met, some kind of tragedy from outside of you, inside of you, something. And your system no longer trusts you. Because if your self was trustworthy, this bad thing never would have happened. So it kind of splits the whole system into parts. Think Inside Out. So it splits the whole system into parts. And you have all these parts running your personality now. And they're not really for you. They're not really for your true self. They're basically just there for survival. Basically just survival. And some of the worst parts of our personality are run by these things. Some of our shadow places, some of the things we try to hide from ourselves, from others. And there's a danger in trying to weed out those parts early on, because that'll just create study a lot of neurology, other black parts, other dark parts in the brain, other disconnections. In trying to fix one behavior, you're going to like overemphasize another behavior. And so I was thinking, this kind of fits with that theory, because one of the main points of that theory is you have to basically just bring yourself to maturity. Like, it's not about like weeding out all these bad behaviors and reacting to them anxiously. That's a word that came up a lot as I thought about this. It's not about being anxious about those parts. It's about bringing yourself to maturity, really growing and becoming larger than them. And then it's easy to separate. But before that moment, if you try to kind of separate from that stuff, other parts of you are going to be damaged.
Well, I think, like, as you say that, I've done a little bit of that thanks to you. But I think that invites a very gracious journey.
Yes.
That invites a journey that isn't like shaming those parts of me that really were just trying to help me survive in some way. The fear, the anxiety, whatever that is. And that's thankfully been, because I'm very quick to shame myself. My journey has been more gracious because of that. That seeing it as like, oh no, those things got you here. You can't just dismiss them. You have to like graciously, I don't know, maybe not incorporate's not the right word, but
I always picture like thank them for doing their job.
Yeah.
And saying like, hey, but I no longer need you at the controls.
Yeah.
Feel free to hang out. Yeah. Feel a beautiful mind. When it's like, hey, all these different people inside of me I'm talking to, they're still all around me. I see them. But I'm just not going to listen to them anymore.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, anger, thanks. you got me through those first 20 years. You helped me survive. I'm now 25 and I'm here. Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't need you anymore though. But that 15-year-old's not going to be able to, so the parent of the 18-year-old, it's like, don't be angry, and it's like, something else is going to be breaking there, which creates a tension because how do you maybe instruct your kids, but also pay attention to what this parable is inviting you into. And then that's when I think I thought of my guru over at Covenant, Dan Zink. One of the things he said, I wrote it down. He has as many rants inside of him as I do about things. One of his current ones is about like the Christian counseling culture, and he says we make everything about eliminating problems, which is such a damaging mistake because the holy work, the gospel, always invites you into is growth. And
that's really good.
Yeah, and so
if he hasn't written that somewhere, he needs to so that he can be quoted. Like,
he's almost exactly like me. So the things we think and say will never be anywhere. And I thought, besides the anxiety part, that kept coming up about elimination of problems versus growth. And I always say, if I'm going to write a book about Jesus, it'd be called The Unanxious Jesus. Like Jesus is so unanxious. I mean, even the disciples, he tells the story and walks away. They're like, no, tell us what it means. Because we need to like dissect it and do it. And so he does, but there's just an unanxiety about him. And Kyle, you were saying that, pain is a, prerequisite of life if you're going to live. I was thinking of a movie I saw on Netflix about an actor, Jonah Hill, basically went to therapy and liked his therapist so much he made a movie about him and put it on Netflix. And it's just him and his therapist talking for about 90 minutes. And there's parts I like about it, parts I don't. But one of my favorite things is Stutz, his therapist, says, there's 3 certainties of reality no one can avoid. And it's 3 realities. And it's pain, it's uncertainty, and it's constant work. And I think we're running around trying to eliminate those things at all costs when the gospel's just inviting us to grow. And so we see stuff inside of us as like, man, if that wasn't there, this would be easier. If nobody knew that, life would be easier. If me as a spouse, life would be easier. It's like we're trying to eliminate pain. We're trying to eliminate constant work. We're trying to eliminate uncertainty.
But that's my natural response. Like I want comfort. I mean, that's probably most everybody, maybe for different reasons, but like I want comfort. I basically want non-conflict situations at all costs. And oftentimes those are the things that
So you pull those weeds.
Right.
How does that work?
No, it's not great. I'm still as anxious. I'm still whatever as I've ever been.
And usually my solutions to manage things just pretty much, make everyone even more mad most of the time. So
well, and is that just to keep the I think about the parable or the image of the parable in mind. Like if wheat and the weeds are like indistinguishable from each other at early stages of growth, how often in our own lives are we running around and we try to pluck a weed that actually is wheat, right? Like it's a problem or it's an issue that actually is, if we just let it develop, we'll realize, there's a whole lot of growth that can come from whatever that thing is that originally I thought, that actually wasn't good. Yeah. But God's actually doing something.
Well, I don't know if this fits with that exactly, but like I'm somebody who has struggled for a long time with depression, sort of off and on, sometimes very to a very significant degree. And I've, in the past, risked vulnerability and shared that with some people and not gotten the best response always. Just like, well, why do you feel that? You have Jesus. Like, how do you, like, almost just like just get rid of that thing. Well, first, it's not that easy anyway. Even if I could, I don't know now that I'd want to, because there's all sorts of good that comes from the working through those things. If I'm willing to, I think, step into it rather just like hide under the covers and be depressed. And that you may have to do that. I don't want to make anybody feel bad if that's where they're at. I've been there. But like, it'd be very easy for my younger self to be like, depression's the weed, or whatever is the cause of the depression is the weed. And now I'm 37 and I'm like, it's really such a wonderful invitation for all sorts of reasons. But it is, to your point, Brett, it's very hard work.
Yeah.
It's exhausting.
And it's hard work not to probably be convinced by those around you that it's a weed as well, because it's getting in the way of whatever they want you to be.
But I don't know, like without it, I don't know that I ever write poetry. There's a lot of things that I do now that I don't know that I do without some of those things that I maybe would have named as weeds in my past.
Yeah. Parker Palmer is Quaker, writes a bunch of books on higher education. He wrote a book once called Let Your Life Speak, about his depression. And he has a chapter in there called The Weight of God is Down. And he talks about somebody once telling him that humility was key to the spiritual life. And he was like, oh, that was great. I was proud to think of myself as so humble. And he goes, and I didn't realize through this journey of depression that what they meant was humiliation. And he goes, where you're brought low, this is probably going to be a misquote, where you're brought low, rendered powerless, stripped of all your pretenses and defenses, and left feeling fraudulent, useless, and alone. And he goes, and that's the only thing that allows you to regrow your life from the ground up in God.
It sounds horrible.
Yeah,
but
yeah,
it's
yeah.
but it's a wonderful starting point. Like,
yeah. And I feel like Jesus's constant invitation, or the gospel's constant invitation, is into like the humiliation of the self by the self. You know, I mean, even, you know, are you the weed? Are you the wheat? And it's like, yeah, you're probably both. But Romans 7, you know, I feel like is pretty, like Paul's saying he can set his watch to it. You know, like how often, like he is his own enemy.
He does the thing he doesn't want to do, and yet he still does it, and yet he shouldn't do it. But he's like, you get this picture into his soul as he's struggling with something that ultimately, you know, whereas Romans 7 and Romans 8 end up going is he's created for good work, and God is at work through, and he's glorified through it all too.
Yeah, so it's like, hey, did you plant bad wheat? No, I planted great wheat. Then how'd the weeds get there? Well, I mean, I snuck out at night and planted weeds too.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's not very helpful. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I don't know. And now I'm going to get mad at somebody else for there being weeds in my field.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know. I feel like Jesus, like there's just something in, you know, the Gospels. It's a constant. I think of, you know, maybe the pinnacle of his teaching, Sermon on the Mount. You know, there's a, hey, you've heard it said, external bad behavior. Don't murder. I tell you, anyone who's got anger in his heart is a murderer. I don't know. It just seems like a constant, hey, no one needs to be looking for enemies outside of there. Like they're all here. Yeah. Constant
that feels like that downward.
Yeah. The weight of God is down, like down and in. And just like really wrestling with that. And whatever we're talking about, unanxiously trying to grow instead of like just solve problems.
Yeah.
And
just manage behavior.
Or just eliminate behavior.
Yeah.
Yes.
Eliminate pain.
Manage your behavior and then do some sort of posturing so that you look like you've got it all together and you're not managing your behavior. And then there's so much freedom when you just finally are like, yeah, here's my weeds. Yeah. Here they are.
Well, and I think that's what, you know, the harshest words that Jesus has are for the insiders. They're for the Pharisees, they're for the scribes, they're for the teachers of the law, the people who are overly focused on behavior, even Sermon on the Mount, like praying in the public and, you know, giving alms, right, in ways that are very, very seen. And often, like, I think Jesus wants to just meet us in the ordinary, the small, the moments of very subtle growth and change, and he's most glorified in that too. So we only have really probably a few more minutes, but what I want to do is just ask you guys, like, when you think about growth, like that was kind of the main emphasis of this weekend is like, hey, if Jesus matters most, when Jesus matters most, transformation follows. If we allow Jesus to matter most in our lives, and we bring our whole selves, knowing that he wants to change and transform our whole selves, not just the areas of our lives that aren't, you know, that we don't think measure up, or we're not doing the thing that we think we should be doing. What are things that you've found to be, I know this is a very broad question, but to be found helpful for you when you think about your own growth, your own maturity, the ways that God has shaped or changed you or others? Like, what are a few things that come to mind? What are things that you pursue maybe regularly as regular practices to continue to walk into the growth that Jesus has for you?
It's a good question. I tend to conceptualize things and go broad, so I'm trying to like shrink my answer.
Yeah.
One of the things I was thinking about of where this took me was, we have a right brain that's trying to comprehend the world and like accept it and understand the like mystery and nuance of it all. And then we have a left brain that's trying to apprehend the world and just like break it down to ones and zeros, utilize it to get what we want out of the world. And I was thinking this is an invitation, this parable into like out of your left brain places of like, hey, don't just try to eliminate problems, manage your life. Like takes you out of you centered into like gospel centered, which takes you out of anxiety and into empathy, of like understanding yourself. Kyle, you're talking a lot about that. Instead of like judging, shaming yourself. And I just think, how do you do that? How do you do that work? I think of the fall, how does it start? It's like we're listening to like fear and anxiety. We're listening to the snake. And then what do? We go for management. We grab the apple because we're managing. And I think a lot of my growth over the years has been the opposite of that process, like the opposite of the fall, kind of reversing that of like not covering myself up, not hiding in the bushes, not playing, verbal gymnastics with like the woman you gave me, like not being defensive. And I don't know, I think that kind of equals, finding one or two key people to just try to be humiliated in front of. And I think I have, of like to practice like humiliate myself to myself often. And like I said, not out of shame, out of like, man, like people don't like these words, but I'm going to use them. There's got to be a better way to say it. I always feel like the gospel is inviting you out of shame and into guilt. Like, hey, like you're behaving badly, but you are a child of God, and so it's always asking for like a behavior correction, but it's always inviting you into like the dignity of being, like you are a child of God, you are an image bearer, and you're up to some shenanigans. So like clean that up a bit, and so it's like I think like an step 4 in AA, my mind just starts flying. Step 4 in AA is the thing that separates usually kids from adults. And it's called a searching and fearless moral inventory. And that's when most people quit AA. And I think it's like being able to just do that unanxiously with yourself, and then having like one or two key people in your life you can do it out loud with. And I think that's made all the difference to me.
Yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah, I think sort of the opposite. Your mind is always on. One of my moves is to force myself to think. Like my natural tendency is like I'm so maybe naturally resistant to being like, I think, awake beyond just like the watching the Netflix and the being obsessed about whatever, any number of things that aren't bad things in and of themselves, but I can just cease to exist by consuming those things. So I like one of my moves has been to learn to just wake up, to listen to the people around me. I think I've learned through all of this that God shows up in way more ways than just me reading the Bible and just me praying. God shows up in my children when they're like, hey, what you said to Liam was pretty mean. And I'm like, but you're 5. You don't know. That's like what my natural response would be. But I think I've also learned everything is your teacher. So if I'm willing to sort of, again, set my ego aside, can I listen to a 5-year-old tell me, hey, you're being a jerk? And how do I respond to that? So that's been it. I think another thing is, like Bret said, finding a couple people that you can risk being vulnerable with. Sometimes you do that and you it fails. Sometimes you think, oh, this is the person, and it doesn't go the way that you hope it would, but you risk again because there's all sorts of wonderful things that come from the risking. So it's hard for me to put into like concise thinking again because I'm not thinking all the time, but I just think growth is much broader in the best ways possible than I ever thought growing up.
Yeah.
And to see how I'll probably get this wrong. Please correct me. But that just made me think of one more thing. Like I thought of how it's all tied together, with the self and others. Mm-hmm. So I think in the story where Mary pours out the perfume on Jesus' head, is it Judas? Is it?
Yeah, Judas, because he's the guy that handles all the money. So he's like, I see how this could be used.
Let's go anxious and let's go problems to solve instead of like unanxious, just experiencing empathetic growth and letting the moment be. He goes anxious and he goes fix problems. Yeah, and he tries to like, hey, we could have sold that. We could have split it up, these ministry, but and he just doesn't understand that. Maybe that's another book, the glorious inefficiency of Jesus. There's just
write that one down.
That's good.
There's an inefficiency to Jesus that is such a good teacher when you read the Gospels.
Our culture is be efficient.
Yeah,
I think maybe even in Christian culture to some degree, but be very efficient.
Well, even like, okay, what are my goals this year? How am I? We almost like prescribe our own change. How am I going to change this year? Yeah. Right? What are my resolutions? What am I going to do the thing that I need to do to grow? And again, not discounting those things. Like those are good conversations to have. Those are good things to look into our lives and, okay, I want to read this book because I need to grow in this area or I learn in this. But we almost like, I don't know, we can get way anxious with either the lack of growth that we expect to see or we think others expect to see in us, or we can go the opposite and just be complacent and not be involved with it whatsoever.
I think we also expect huge amounts of growth too. Like one of my favorite authors, he writes fantasy. He just talks, there's a quote that he talks about like sometimes somebody takes 2 steps forward or 2 steps back, but given enough time, everybody kind of ends up where they were. Yeah. I think oftentimes that's true, but I think it's partly because we expect, when we set these goals and these things, we expect so much growth, and it's really like a turning of the dial just a bit. Like it's, I don't know. So I'm in a place now where I'm trying to celebrate like the step. Mm-hmm. Like I'm not as far as I'd like, but maybe I've stepped.
Everything's linear too. Like, okay, here's my growth. Here's where I am, and that's where I need to go. And so like, let's just draw a straight line to get there. Yeah. When like growth is way more.
There's no straight lines.
Holistic, I don't know.
Yeah. If we bend it all back to one of the first things you said, like if you said like, man, if I'm not doing that, I cease to exist. I don't, do you remember what I said?
That's it.
Yeah. And so if we take it to the Judas story, it's like, hey, this moment, finances, this moment, this person, these are all problems that need managed. Mm-hmm. These are all problems that need to be solved. He's not focused on growth. Then eventually later on in the story, that becomes Jesus is a problem that's got to be managed and solved. So he turns him in. And then it becomes he's a problem and it leads to suicide. He's his own problem that needs to be managed and solved. And I don't know, and it's just like you start going that anxiety route. You start going that non-growth route and things just get tighter and tighter. And now like your spiritual life suffers. Your emotional life, how you're holding yourself, how you're holding others. And I don't know, you cease to exist.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'd say just to kind of summarize the conversation, like we need to be curious. We need to be curious about the world that God has put us in. We need to be curious about the ways that he is wanting to grow and shape us and not be arrogant to say, oh, these are the things that God wants to do. And here's exactly how he's going to do that in us. And then I do think like we need other people. We need others who we're willing to be honest with. They're willing to be honest with us, and let's put our stuff on the table because we're all trying to do this thing together and no one's got it figured out. And so let's be open to what God has for us. Well, thank you guys for joining for this conversation. I know it's only been, we could go for another hour.
Easy. Easy. Yeah.
So
I'm jazzed right now.
Yeah. It's like, okay, I just got not nervous being behind this microphone.
Hey, so that's good. That means we'll have more conversations to come in the future.
You'll never hear from me again. I just think it's funny that you started this whole thing off with, hey, we talked about hell, on to some lighter stuff.
Yeah. And it's all just a facade.
And then we just talked about all that.
It's a facade. Anyway, thank you for listening to this episode of The Deep Dive. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Bret, for just bringing your whole selves into it, and for just me personally, getting a front row seat to watch how God is growing you. And it's not always easy. It's not always fun. And yet God is still glorified in it. And so as always, if you have any questions, please, you can email us at podcast@calvary.church. You can find this resource and more on our website, calvary.church/resources. And we look forward to connecting again next week and in the weeks to come as we continue to examine different parables that Jesus tells and how they just interact with our own lives. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive, a Calvary Church Media Productions podcast. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts.